All right. So welcome again. This is the second of 3 weeks when I will be talking about, and we will be talking together about the Pure Land tradition of Buddhism. So what I'm going to do tonight, I'm going to recap very briefly on what we talked about last week, then we'll launch into, which was real basics and the early history in China. And then tonight we'll talk about the heart of historical Pure Land, which is its evolution in Japan around the 12th century-ish and some subsequent developments. And some of the doctrines and practices and teachings that come out of that. And next week, it's Pure Land as a lived tradition, and I'll be focusing then primarily on a book called the Tanisho, the translation of which I cannot remember, but it was written by a disciple of Shinran, who we will talk about, and it was at a time when he felt some of the core teachings were falling into disarray, so it was a corrective for everyday living. And there's a link to a book by Bloom on that text if anybody's interested in looking at it on the website, on the Thursday event piece on the website. Bloom was an American Pure Land Buddhist who did a series of lectures on a radio show, something like 20 or 25 lectures. Those lectures. So, Pure Land Buddhism. I think it's important for us to know a little bit about Pure Land Buddhism because it is the largest sect of Buddhism in the world. It is very different in many ways from what most of us in this country are familiar with as Buddhism, but it overlaps in very interesting ways, and it sheds light on the teachings in our practice in interesting ways. But it's the largest sect, and it gives some, as we look at the history of it as well, it gives us some lens on the diversity of Buddhism, which as Buddhists it's kind of important we know something about. The story, it has Indian roots. There are sutras that come out of India. Historically they appear to have been written like 1st, 2nd century of the Common Era. Simple story is many kalpas ago there was somebody who became a bodhisattva by the name of Dharmakara, and he vowed that he would not wake up fully, he would not become fully enlightened and fail to return until he could establish a Pure Land, and he knew every living being would be reborn in the Pure Land with no losing a re-word, but no falling back, and they would continue to learn there until they all became Buddhas. He made a whole series of vows, etc., and that happened, and so then he became Amitayus, the Buddha of infinite light, the Western Buddha, Western Pure Land Buddha. Within all these teachings, the 18th vow becomes the focal point of this teaching, which is Nyan Pho. It's holding Buddha in mind. Nyan Pho. Pho is Buddha, and Nyan is holding in mind. So that's the core teaching. It went from India into China. Shi Yi was 6th century China. He was one of the great Buddhist teachers of the history of Buddhism. He founded the Tiantai tradition, which we think of as, is largely thought of as the Pure Land tradition. The Tiantai, I guess that means great heaven. Could be wrong, but I think that's what it means. But it's we largely think of it as the Lotus Sutra tradition, but actually he was a great integrator of all the Buddhist texts that were coming into China, great synthesizer of all of those teachings. And yes, he centered on the Lotus Sutra, but he also wrote a very substantial treatise which translates as stopping and seeing, which Shamatha Vipassana, insight and wisdom, or insight and stilling. It's that's core Theravadan teachings, right? So, and his teachings led into sudden awakening and gradual awakening, which became the division in Chan of Northern and Southern School, and then Rinzai and Soto in China. I mean, he was just profoundly influential. And he developed a practice of constantly walking meditation. So you just 90 days, just basically you're walking for 90 days, and all you're doing is chanting Namo Wami 2 or 4, which is I take refuge in Amida Buddha in Chinese. So that was 6th century China, and at that time, and for all of its history in China, Pure Land Buddhism was not a sect. Pure Land Buddhism was a dharma gate. It was a practice, along with sitting, along with other chanting, along with walking. It was and other practices. It was just one of many dharma gates. So that's enough of the history in China. I mean, it's got a long history in China. There were major teachers and reformers. There was Xu Hong in 17th century China was another one who was also dual lineage. He was a Zen master and a Pure Land master, which gives some sense of this as just a dharma gate. But long history, continuing history in China. It jumped to Japan around about the same time as Shi, 6th century. It left the China Sea and came to Japan. And at that time, it was the same as in China. It was just a practice. It wasn't a school, it was a practice. Amitabha was this Buddha, there was this 18th vow, you hold the Amida Buddha in mind, and it is helpful to your practice. But it's not the only thing you do. By around the 10th century, it was becoming popular in Japan, popular and populist. It was originally a tradition that was held more closely within the imperial community, but it leaked out. You had traveling monks wandering around teaching Pure Land Buddhism. At its heart, it opens itself up to become a very accessible teaching. So it started to become very popular. By around about the 10th century, there were deathbed rituals where people would stand beside the bed of somebody who was dying, and they would chant Namu Amida Buddha, by then Namu Amida Butsu in Japan, on behalf of the dying person. The dying person would chant in company, praying for release, I guess. And it was also, that time was also seen in Japan by a lot of Buddhists as a time of the deterioration and degeneration of Buddhist teachings. So there was a quest to find something new, something rejuvenative, something that would allow us to work with simpler teachings in a more difficult time. So there were reasons why Pure Land became a popular practice in Japan. And by around about the 11th century, 100 years later, it was starting to show up in some places in a more sectarian kind of way. So this is what we do. It's not a practice, it's the practice for us. The 12th and 13th century in Japan, from a Buddhist standpoint, were a really interesting time. Tiantai we talked about in China, which was seen as Lotus Sutra, but actually very broad. That came to Japan and became the Tendai tradition in Japan, so it's basically transliteration of the word. And it was centered on Mount Hiei, which was just a huge monastery, and it was the center of Buddhism in Japan, as far as I can tell. But by this time, it was becoming very esoteric, kind of scattered, and a lot of the practitioners in that tradition were unhappy with the practice. So around this time, late 12th century, early 13th century, you had a guy by the name, I think it was Eni Bushi, something like that. He had been a Lotus Sutra or a practitioner, he'd been a Tendai practitioner, and he left Mount Hiei, and he founded what comes to us now as the Rinzai sect. At the same time, Dogen, 1200 to 1253 are his dates, he was on Mount Hiei, he left, and after going to China, he founded Soto. Nichiren, overlapping dates as well. Nichiren got fed up with all the stuff that was going on Mount Hiei. He left, and he founded what comes down as the Nichiren Shu, the Nichiren school of Lotus Sutra Buddhism, which is focused entirely on chanting the title of the Lotus Sutra, and he became very dogmatic, very divisive in many ways in Japan, because he was very exclusive about the Lotus Sutra sect, disparaging of other traditions. And Nichiren Shu then gives rise to Soga Kai and Rishikose Kei and all the other Second World War-ish Lotus Sutra sects. So this all came out at that same period, late 12th, early 13th century Japan and Mount Hiei. At that same time, there was a guy, Honen, whose dates are 1133 to 1212. He was not having a good time at Mount Hiei. He found himself captivated by the power of the primal vow, which is Amida Buddha's or Dharmakara's vow not to enter enlightenment until he knew everybody had a chance to be reborn in the Pure Land, in his Pure Land, and then to wake up there. So that's the primal vow that predates the existence that this populace believed they had. And it's just this massive, compassionate, open compassion gesture. So Honen was compelled by that, and he left, and he founded what has become Jodo Shinshu, which is the Jodo school of Pure Land Buddhism. And it was an exclusive sect. His practice was chanting Namu Amida Butsu. That was it. Didn't do anything else. He made no bones about it. He went and told the emperor, all the other forms of Buddhism are nonsense. This is what you do. Nichiren did the same with the title of the Lotus Sutra, by the way. So this was going on in Japan at this time. So Honen got on quite well with the imperial crowd, and that was fine, but there were some other people who didn't like it. It became very political. He was banished. But one of the major schools comes down to us, which is this Jodo Shinshu. Around the same time, Shinran dates 1173 to 1263, so just a little bit later, 50 years later, but he was a disciple of Honen. He had been at Mount Hiei, and he was having a really hard time. He was clearly somebody who was totally committed to his practice, but he had feelings of inadequacy in his practice, and he just despaired of waking up. He just despaired of the fruit of the practice that was so important to him. So he left with Honen when Honen left the monastery, and when Honen was banished, he too was banished. And he took all this a lot harder than Honen. Really interesting things happened with him. He always thought of himself as a student of Honen, and he had no intention of doing anything other than just following Honen's teaching. But what ended up happening was the flavor he brought to the practice added something rich, and that became actually I've written these down wrong. Honen was Jodo Shu, I believe. Shinran was Jodo Shinshu, because Shin is the pure and the refined. So Shinran is the Shin school of Pure Land Buddhism. Anyway, and that is actually the largest sect. But Shinran, because he was kicked out of the monastery and banished, he was not registered with the emperor, so he wasn't an official religion, which meant he wasn't under any celibacy rules. So he married and he had kids. And it meant he had a blood lineage, so that his children and their children and so forth all carried on, and that had benefits and costs, and it's just very complicated stuff. The center of a lot of what he got caught up on was this sense of personal inadequacy he felt, this internal weakness. The chanting, he did not feel confident that the chanting would do it. So there's this gesture of generosity, of compassion from Amida Buddha that says, you chant my name, take refuge in me, and I'll come and help. And he didn't feel confidence in that. So what ended up happening is kind of Calvin's conundrum. Double predestination, predestined to go to heaven or predestined not to. So the reconciliation here was faith or entrustment. So he's got the compassion, which results in the call for help, and the faith or the entrustment, which is just this opening up. So you've got both sides working together. And that's what then becomes the much more open and rich Shin Pure Land tradition. that comes down to us as the largest Japanese sect. So there's a story here which I will tell, which for me captures the heart of the Pure Land Buddhist tradition. So you've got the aspirant, the pilgrim, whatever you want to call them, who is being chased by a gang of bandits and wild and hungry beasts, and they're coming at him from like all around behind. So he's being pushed in a particular, he or she is being pushed in a particular direction, and as they're rushing forward, there's no escape to the sides because the bandits and the wild animals are closing in from all sides. And so this individual is being shepherded forward to what, as it comes into focus, is a river of fire and a river of water separated by a narrow strip of white land, just inches wide. So this individual just slows down as they approach this, and just terror. 3 deaths: death by fire, death by water, death by wild beasts. What is one to do? Voice behind calls, go ahead, go forward, cross the white path. You will be safe, you will be saved. Voice from in front, across the other side of the path, calls, come forward, come to me, come as you are, and I will protect you, I will save you. River of fire is anger, river of water, greed, wild beasts, ignorance, the bandits, the exciting and wonderful, ice cream, the Ferrari, all the wonderful things of life that are beckoning us to go back. The voice from behind, Shakyamuni Buddha. The voice from the other side, come as you are, I will save you. There's Amida. So just goes along this narrow path, and Amida's calling them and pulling them forward. So basic teachings of Pure Land, the basic construct, it incorporates or respects the basic Buddhist teachings of karma, interbeing, 12-link chain of causation, enlightenment, all that good stuff. We talked last time about self-power and other power, and that is a difficult construct for us, the way that Insight, Theravadan, Zen, most of the Buddhist traditions that have landed in America work, because we tend to have this self-powered thing where I'm sitting and I'm going to investigate myself and I will do it. That's what this is about. It's about my effort to find the path. And the idea of being able to let go of that effort and say, no, I'm going to trust that there is other power that will do this for me, is a difficult one for a lot of American Buddhists to embrace. We come by that honestly. But to me, there's already a part of this built into the practices we have, and it's not as different as we think it is. That other power is universal compassion. It's that dude sitting up there. Buddha taught and came back with compassion for everybody. There is a teaching that comes down to us because somebody woke up and said, this is available to you. And the very nature of that teaching is that it is possible for each of us to open up to and to become universal compassion. So this other power, in an important sense, is nothing other than that universal compassion that we are practicing with and trying to cultivate. So it's simply acknowledging that and just opening right up to it and letting that help us. Letting ourselves help ourselves. In the Zen tradition, there's this idea, so Soto Zen, Dogen, who was the founder of Soto Zen, talked about him going to China because he was dissatisfied with Tiendai, and he met his teacher there, Nyojo, I think his name was, And so he was sitting in Nyojo's monastery, and he had this profound awakening, and he's like this excited 30-year-old monk. He runs into Nyojo's room and says, Shinjin Datsurak! Shinjin Datsurak! Which means dropping off body and mind. Body and mind had dropped off. He was sitting, and there was this experience of end of body, end of mind, awakening. I am consciousness that does not land. Nyojo laughed. Datsurak, Datsurak. Dropping off Datsurak. Dropping off, dropping off. Drop off that too. There's actually a saying in Naqshbendi Sufism, which is Terki dunya, Terki hesta, Terki something else. Terki terk. Terki is dropping off in Arabic. So this is dropping off this world, dropping off the other world, dropping off the self, dropping off, dropping off. It's this universal dropping off. So who's doing the dropping off? Dropping off body and mind. Who's doing the dropping off? Zen, which is this most hardcore of sit and do it yourself. It's got the whole idea of complete surrender, complete letting go built into it, if we but look at it. So it's really not that different at its heart. But the direction and approach feels different, which makes it sometimes harder for us to see it. And self-power is very much part of this tradition. I mean, the history of it, Pure Land and Zen were growing up alongside and rubbing shoulders with each other. They were both practices in an integrated tradition. You do the sitting, you ask for help. You do the sitting, you ask for help. They complement each other, they're not opposed. And the asking for help actually reinforces something that we are all taught, which is the problem with all self-powered work is the tendency for an ego to form. Egos can be really, really subtle and really hard to see. Zen talks about using a peg to knock out a peg. It's a carpentry metaphor. You use pegs to hold pieces of wood together in glueless carpentry, and you use a smaller peg to knock out a big peg, and you keep on using smaller pegs until finally you can just take out the last little peg. The peg's the ego, and how you keep on knocking in pegs. Somehow you've got this peg left at the end. And it's hard to see the koan of the ox going through the window. So you've got an ox and you've got a big window pane, and the ox wants to get through the window and approaches it, gets its head and its horns and then its shoulders through the window, gets its legs through, front legs, keeps on going, pulls its big chunky body through, gets its rear legs through, gets most of its tail through, and then it's stuck. It can't get the end of its tail through the window. Why can't it get its tail through the window? That last little bit of ego is just so hard to see. This can be really subtle and really tricky. So these two work together. A few other scattered thoughts. They've come together scattered, but they're important thoughts. Namomida Butsu, a way of looking at those three words. Namu, I take refuge, is the I. It's this fragile, fundamentally flawed sack of skin and bones. Butsu, or Amida Butsu will be the enlightened one. It's the absolute. It's the awakened nature, fragile self-awakened nature. And Amida is the power of compassion, the power of universal love, that which saves. That's bringing these two together. It's the container that holds this and that. Not separate, but not the same. And the Amida which represents the vow itself, holds and brings them together. One of the core practices of Shin Buddhism is deep listening. It's talked about as deep listening. Deep listening is really stopping and seeing. It's insight practice, really. And it is intended, deep listening, to allow us to see non-duality, as in the way I've just deconstructed the vow itself, or the chant itself, the asking for help itself. Part of deep listening is also what in Japanese, I will mispronounce it, but is called sononama, as it is. Sounds very familiar, right? Seeing things as it is. Getting our stories out of the way and starting to see clearly what's really there rather than what we think and construct is there. The last one I'll talk about is, or I'll mention, is its universality. It is, from its early days, it was held up as being the easy practice, sitting and staring at a wall and hours of deep meditation, all the self-study, all the self-reflection, all the diligence is hard work. The easy practice is asking for help and trusting that help is available. Again, it's not simple binary work together, but setting them up as extremes and looking at the hard practice and the easy practice and bringing the easy practice in as part of the mix makes Buddhism available to people who simply can't meditate for 3 or 4 hours a day. So it's a profoundly compassionate expression of Buddhism. It's much gentler in many ways. So there really is a universality to this teaching, and it is also sin in Buddhism, fairly universally in Buddhism, is not doesn't have the same connotation as original sin in Christianity, which is how in the West we tend to think of sin. Sin is much more going against nature, and sin is much more something we do to ourselves, generating negative karma in the long run will hurt ourselves. And the construction of this practice is very much built around the deep seeing, allowing us to own our own weakness as human beings, our own innate tendency to sin, which is to think stupid things, to do stupid things, to think and do things that we wish we hadn't done and we wish we weren't going to do, but we do it anyway. And still to make the vow and still be open to this universal compassion saving us. So there's an inherent universality that is actually there in all of Buddhism, but it's much more laid out in the open here than in a lot of other traditions. So that's enough of me talking about this today. Next week, I'll go to the Tanisha, and we'll talk about some of the more everyday aspects of how Pure Land shows up and how, from an everyday perspective, some of these principles may be useful to us.